On June 27, 2010, at approximately 6:32 a.m., FBI agents knocked on the door of a two-story colonial in Cambridge, Massachusetts, carrying arrest warrants that would dismantle a family. Timothy Heathfield was 20 years old, home from Boston University for the summer. His brother Alexander was 16, and within the next 47 minutes, they would learn that their parents were Russian intelligence officers, that their names weren't really Donald and Tracy Heathfield, and that every story they'd been told about their family history was a fabrication designed by the KGB. Donald and Tracy were arrested at 6:47 a.m. on charges of conspiracy to act as unregistered agents of a foreign government. Their real names were Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova. They had been living under false identities since 1990, and by the time they were led out in handcuffs at 7:19 a.m., their sons had become subjects in what federal investigators would later describe as one of the most elaborate deception operations in modern intelligence history. The arrest was part of a coordinated FBI operation that took down 10 Russian illegals across the United States in a single day. The Heathfields lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a 15-minute walk from Harvard Square. They had moved there in 1999 from Toronto, where both boys had been born. The house was a colonial on a street where neighbors knew each other and children rode bicycles to school. Timothy attended Cambridge Ringe and Latin, the same public high school Matt Damon had graduated from years earlier. Alexander was a sophomore there when the arrest happened. According to neighbors interviewed by federal investigators in the weeks following June 27th, the family seemed completely ordinary, the kind of household where someone was always driving someone else to soccer practice or music lessons. Donald worked as a strategic forecasting consultant. He had founded a company called Future Map in 2004, which specialized in risk analysis and strategic planning for corporations and government contractors. The company had satellite offices in Paris and Singapore. He was a member of the World Future Society and regularly attended conferences where he made connections with policy experts, academics, and former government officials. One of those connections was Leon Firth, who had served as National Security Advisor to Vice President Al Gore during the Clinton administration. According to FBI surveillance logs compiled during the investigation, Donald attended multiple conferences where Firth was speaking between 2006 and 2009 and had been photographed in conversation with him at a 2008 event in Washington. Tracy worked in real estate, showing properties in Cambridge and the surrounding suburbs. She had a Massachusetts real estate license, paid quarterly taxes, and according to records from the Cambridge Board of Realtors, had sold approximately 40 properties between 2003 and 2010. The boys played soccer in local leagues. Timothy had been captain of his high school team during his junior year. Alexander played piano, lessons arranged through a teacher their mother had found when they'd first moved to Cambridge. The family owned their home, a 3-bedroom colonial purchased in 2001 for $485,000, according to Middlesex County property records. They attended occasional PTA meetings. They recycled. They shoveled their driveway in winter and mowed their lawn in summer. According to federal prosecutors in the criminal complaint filed on June 26, 2010, they appeared to be exactly what they claimed to be, a successful Canadian-American couple who had built a comfortable professional life in one of the most educated communities in the United States. But the life the Heathfield boys believed they were living had been constructed 20 years earlier in Moscow. In 1988, 2 KGB officers, Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova, began training for an assignment that would require them to live as foreigners for decades. The training, according to declassified SVR documents reviewed during the 2010 legal proceedings, included perfecting English without any trace of Russian accent, studying Canadian and American culture in exhaustive detail, and learning the operational protocols for deep cover intelligence work that the KGB classified as illegal operations, meaning operatives with no official connection to Soviet or Russian diplomatic facilities. The identities they would assume had been selected through a process that involved searching death records in Canada for individuals who had died young before accumulating the kind of documentation that would make impersonation difficult. The real Donald Howard Heathfield had been born in Canada in 1962 and died at approximately 7 weeks old. His death had been registered, but he had never attended school, never obtained a driver's license, never left any substantial documentary trail. The real Tracy Leanne Foley had similarly died young. According to the Canadian Vital Statistics records, both deaths occurred in circumstances that left minimal documentation, making their identities ideal vessels for fabricated lives. By 1990, Andrei Bezrikov and Elena Vavilova had become Donald and Tracy Heathfield in every official capacity. They had Canadian passports, social insurance numbers, and background stories about their families that could withstand casual scrutiny but contained enough vagueness to avoid specific verification. Donald claimed his father had been a Canadian diplomat who had died when Donald was young. Tracy claimed to have been raised in a family that moved frequently for work, explaining why she had few childhood friends or traceable connections to specific locations. They moved to Toronto in 1990. In 1990, Timothy was born in a Toronto hospital, registered as the son of Donald and Tracy Heathfield, Canadian citizens. In 1994, Alexander was born, also in Toronto. The decision to have children, according to FBI counterintelligence assessments, was both personal and operational. Children enhanced the cover, made the family appear more permanent and less suspicious, and created additional reasons for the couple to maintain connection to their assumed community. Donald enrolled at York University in Toronto in 1992, completing a bachelor's degree in economics and political science by 1995. He then attended the École nationale des ponts et chaussées in France, a prestigious engineering and public policy school, earning a master's degree in 1997. The education was legitimate. Donald attended classes, completed coursework, earned degrees that would appear on any background check as authentic credentials from respected institutions. He later attended Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, where his classmates included individuals who would go on to significant positions in government and policy, including Felipe Calderón, who would become President of Mexico in 2006. By 1999, when the family moved from Toronto to Cambridge, Donald Heathfield had credentials that would satisfy any employer conducting standard verification. Elena had developed a professional history in real estate and administrative work, and Timothy and Alexander had birth certificates, school records, and Canadian citizenship that identified them as the sons of Canadian parents with no connection to Russia. What those credentials concealed was a systematic intelligence operation that had been active since their arrival in North America. Between 1999 and 2010, according to FBI counterintelligence reports declassified during the legal proceedings, Donald and Tracy Heathfield transmitted classified and sensitive information to SVR handlers through methods designed to be undetectable to their own children. The intelligence they provided was not the kind of dramatic classified documents often depicted in espionage fiction, but rather the accumulated insights, assessments, and connections that came from Donald's position at the intersection of business, academia, and policy analysis. Donald's work at FutureMap gave him access to strategic planning discussions with corporate clients and government contractors. He produced reports on geopolitical risk, economic forecasting, and international trade policy. According to the criminal complaint filed by federal prosecutors, some of these reports were shared with his SVR handlers, providing Moscow with assessments of American strategic thinking and policy directions. The value was not in stolen secrets, but in Donald's legitimate access to the conversations and assumptions that shaped American foreign policy and business strategy. His connections at Harvard and in Washington policy circles provided additional intelligence value. The conversations he had at conferences, the professional relationships he cultivated, the insights he gained from speaking with former government officials like Leon Furth. All of this constituted information that SVR analysts in Moscow could use to better understand American decision-making processes. According to FBI surveillance transcripts, Donald met with his SVR handler approximately once every 6 weeks between 2006 and 2010, always in public locations, always in ways that would appear to casual observers as ordinary business meetings or chance encounters. Tracy's intelligence gathering was more limited, but still operationally valuable. Her work in real estate gave her reason to travel throughout the Boston area, to maintain a flexible schedule, and to meet with a wide range of people without raising suspicion. According to the FBI's operational assessment, she served primarily as a communications facilitator, receiving and transmitting messages through methods that included coded shortwave radio transmissions, dead drops, and encrypted digital communications. The dead drops, a technique dating to Cold War espionage but still operationally effective, involved leaving materials at predetermined locations for pickup by Russian intelligence officers or couriers. According to FBI surveillance documentation, one dead drop location was in a park in the Boston suburbs, where Tracy would leave a shopping bag containing documents or a USB drive behind a specific tree, marked by a small piece of chalk on a nearby post. The FBI documented at least 6 such exchanges between 2008 and 2010. The couple communicated with Moscow through encrypted shortwave radio transmissions, a method that required specific equipment but was difficult to trace or intercept in ways that would provide actionable evidence. According to the criminal complaint, FBI technical surveillance identified radio transmissions from the Heathfield residence on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, always between 9:30 p.m. and 11:00 p.m., times when the boys would typically be in their rooms doing homework or sleeping. The transmissions were brief, lasting no more than 5 minutes, and consisted of encrypted bursts that would sound like static to anyone casually listening. The operational discipline required to maintain this double life while raising 2 children was, according to federal investigators, extraordinary. Donald and Tracy never spoke Russian in their home. They never discussed their work with each other in ways that the boys might overhear. They maintained their cover identities so completely that Timothy and Alexander would later tell investigators they had never noticed anything unusual about their parents' behavior, never suspected anything beyond what they claimed to be. The operation was methodical, sustained, and according to this sentencing memorandum filed by federal prosecutors in July 2010, had been providing Moscow with valuable intelligence assessments for over a decade. In 2006, FBI counterintelligence agents tracking Russian intelligence activities in the United States identified communication patterns that suggested the presence of multiple deep cover operatives operating without diplomatic protection. The investigation, later designated Operation Ghost Stories, began with surveillance of suspected Russian intelligence officers in New Jersey and gradually expanded as agents identified connections to other individuals living under what appeared to be false identities. The Heathfields came to FBI attention in 2007 through financial analysis that revealed irregularities in how they had funded their home purchase and Donald's business operations. According to court documents filed in support of the arrest warrants, investigators discovered that funds had been transferred through a series of accounts that traced back to banks with connections to Russian intelligence services. The amounts were not large enough to trigger automatic reporting requirements, but the patterns were consistent with covert funding mechanisms documented in previous cases involving Russian illegals. By 2008, the FBI had placed the Heathfield residence under physical and technical surveillance. Agents documented Donald's meetings with individuals later identified as SVR officers operating under diplomatic cover at the Russian consulate in New York. They photographed Tracy at locations that matched known dead drop sites. They recorded the encrypted radio transmissions from the house on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, though they could not decrypt the content in real time. The investigation expanded to include surveillance of 8 other individuals across 4 states, all living under false identities, all connected through similar operational patterns and funding mechanisms. According to FBI operational reports, the network appeared to be coordinated from Moscow, with individual operatives assigned to different regions and different intelligence collection priorities. The Heathfields' focus on policy analysis and strategic forecasting complemented other operatives who were targeting different sectors, including defense technology, financial policy, and political intelligence. The decision to arrest all 10 individuals simultaneously was made in early June 2010, according to declassified Justice Department memos. The timing was driven partly by concerns that one member of the network, operating under the name Anna Chapman in New York, had become aware of FBI surveillance and might alert the others. Federal prosecutors determined they had sufficient evidence to charge all 10 with conspiracy to act as unregistered agents of a foreign government, a charge that carried a maximum sentence of 5 years, and conspiracy to commit money laundering, which carried additional penalties. The arrest warrants were prepared on June 26, 2010. FBI field offices in Boston, New York, New Jersey, and Virginia coordinated the timing to ensure all 10 arrests would occur within a 2-hour window on the morning of June 27th, minimizing the possibility that any members of the network could warn the others or destroy evidence. By June 2010, federal prosecutors had compiled what the charging documents described as overwhelming evidence of a long-term espionage operation involving 10 Russian intelligence officers who had collectively spent over 150 years living under false identities in the United States. Timothy Heathfield was asleep in his bedroom on the 2nd floor when he heard heavy knocking at 6:32 a.m. According to his later account in an interview with Canadian media, his first thought was that something had happened to a neighbor, that there was an emergency requiring immediate attention. He heard his father's voice downstairs, heard the front door open, then heard voices he didn't recognize identifying themselves as federal agents. Alexander was already awake, according to FBI agent testimony later filed in court proceedings. He had come out of his room and was standing at the top of the stairs when approximately 6 agents entered the house through the front door that Donald had opened. The agents were wearing FBI windbreakers and carrying credentials. 2 of them went immediately upstairs, instructed Alexander to remain where he was, and knocked on Timothy's door. The arrest warrant was executed at 6:47 a.m. According to the FBI operational report, Donald and Tracy were taken into custody in the kitchen. Tracy had been making coffee. Donald had been sitting at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper. The arresting agents informed them they were being charged with conspiracy to act as unregistered agents of a foreign government. Donald asked if he could speak to his attorney. Tracy looked at the stairs where both boys were now standing with 2 FBI agents and said nothing. Timothy and Alexander were brought downstairs and told to sit in the living room. According to Timothy's later recollection, one of the agents asked if they understood what was happening. Timothy said he did not. The agent asked if their parents had ever told them anything about working for a foreign government. Both boys said no. The agent asked if they had ever heard their parents speak Russian. Both boys said their parents didn't speak Russian, that they were Canadian, that there must be some mistake. At 7:02 a.m., according to FBI processing logs, a senior agent sat down with Timothy and Alexander and informed them that their parents were Russian intelligence officers, that their real names were Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova, and that they had been living under false identities since before the boys were born. Timothy's response, documented in the agent's report, was to say that wasn't possible, that his father had a degree from Harvard, that his mother was from Canada, that they had family there. The agent told him that those facts were part of their cover story, that the people they believed were their parents had constructed those identities deliberately. Alexander, who was 16, asked if he and Timothy were under arrest. The agent said they were not, that they were not suspected of any involvement in their parents' activities, but that they would need to come to a federal facility for questioning to establish what they knew and when they knew it. Alexander asked what would happen to their parents. The agent said they would be held pending arraignment on federal charges. By 7:19 a.m., Donald and Tracy were being transported in separate vehicles to a federal detention facility in Boston. Timothy and Alexander were driven in an unmarked car to an FBI field office, where they were placed in separate rooms and questioned for approximately 4 hours each. According to the interview summaries filed with the court, both boys maintained they had no knowledge of their parents' intelligence work, had never suspected anything unusual, had believed completely that they were a Canadian-American family with the history their parents had described. The questions were specific. Had they ever seen their parents with large amounts of cash? No. Had they ever seen any Russian language materials in the house? No. Had they ever noticed their parents meeting with people who seemed unusual or out of place? No. Had their parents ever taken trips without them that seemed suspicious? No. Had they ever seen any communications equipment beyond normal phones and computers? No. By 8:15 a.m., according to FBI processing records, Timothy and Alexander were being informed that their Canadian citizenship might be invalid, that their parents' real names were Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova, and that they themselves might be Russian citizens by birth despite having been born in Toronto. The information federal investigators provided to Timothy and Alexander over the following 72 hours, documented in FBI debriefing reports and later referenced in court filings, revealed that virtually every fact they knew about their family was constructed fiction. The real Donald Howard Heathfield had died in 1962 at approximately 7 weeks old in a Canadian hospital. His death certificate, obtained by FBI investigators from Ontario Vital Statistics records, listed the cause as sudden infant death syndrome. He had never lived long enough to attend school, obtain identification, or create any documentary trail beyond his birth and death records. Their father had assumed this identity in 1990, fabricating a family history that included a Canadian diplomat father who had died young, explaining why Donald had few childhood photographs or extended family connections. The real Tracy Leanne Foley had similarly died as an infant. According to Canadian government records reviewed during the citizenship revocation proceedings, she had died at 18 months in 1963. Their mother had assumed this identity in 1990, creating a backstory about a transient childhood that conveniently explained the absence of verifiable details about her early life. Andrei Bezrukov had been born in 1965 in the Soviet Union, trained by the KGB in the late 1980s, and assigned to deep cover operations in 1990. Elena Vavilova had been born in 1962, also trained by the KGB, also assigned to illegal operations. According to SVR personnel records that Russian officials later confirmed to international media following the prisoner exchange, both had been decorated intelligence officers before they ever set foot in Canada. Timothy and Alexander were Russian citizens by blood, born to Russian parents who happened to be living in Canada under false identities. Their Canadian citizenship, which they had never questioned, had been issued based on fraudulent birth registrations that listed Donald and Tracy Heathfield as their parents. According to legal analyses conducted by Canadian immigration attorneys during the boys' appeals process, the citizenship had been valid at the time of issuance because the fraud was undetected, but could be retroactively nullified once the true circumstances were established. The language deception was what Timothy later described in interviews as the most psychologically disorienting revelation. Andrei and Elena spoke fluent Russian. They had grown up speaking Russian, had been educated in Russian, had spent their entire lives before 1990 speaking Russian. But for 20 years, they had never spoken a single word of Russian in front of their children. According to FBI linguistic analysis, maintaining that level of operational discipline required conscious effort in every moment of a domestic life, every argument, every casual conversation, every instance where speaking in their native language would have been natural. The family stories Timothy and Alexander had been told were fabrications calibrated to explain away inconsistencies. The reason they had never met their grandparents was not because they had died before the boys were born, but because those grandparents had never existed in the form described. The reason their parents had few childhood friends or connections was not because they had moved frequently, but because Donald and Tracy Heathfield had not existed before 1990. The reason family photo albums began only in the early 1990s was not because earlier photos had been lost, but because there were no earlier photos of their parents living as the people they claimed to be. According to FBI psychological assessments conducted during the initial debriefing period, both Timothy and Alexander exhibited symptoms consistent with acute identity disruption, a psychological condition that occurs when fundamental assumptions about one's personal history and family structure are suddenly invalidated. According to a later interview with one of the brothers, the realization that his parents had maintained complete operational cover for his entire life without a single break in character was what made the deception feel most absolute. Between June 27th and July 9th, 2010, the legal proceedings against the 10 arrested Russian illegals moved with unusual speed. On June 28th, all 10 appeared in federal court for arraignment hearings. Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova, still being referred to in court documents by their assumed names, Donald Heathfield and Tracy Foley, were held without bail at a federal detention facility pending trial. The charges were specific: conspiracy to act as an agent of a foreign government without notifying the Attorney General, a violation of federal law carrying a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison. Conspiracy to commit money laundering related to the methods by which they had received funds from Russian intelligence services to support their operations. The prosecution's evidence, outlined in a 37-page criminal complaint, included intercepted communications, surveillance photographs, and financial records tracing payments from accounts controlled by the SVR. On July 8, 2010, all 10 defendants entered guilty pleas to the conspiracy charges in exchange for immediate deportation to Russia. The plea agreements, filed with the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, stipulated that the defendants would be expelled from the United States and would forfeit any assets obtained through their illegal activities. The agreements made no provision for prison time in the United States, but required the defendants to admit their actions constituted espionage on behalf of the Russian Federation. The speed of the proceedings was driven by diplomatic negotiations that had been occurring simultaneously with the legal process. According to State Department cables later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, the Russian government had immediately begun discussing a prisoner exchange, offering to release individuals imprisoned in Russia for alleged espionage on behalf of the United States in exchange for the 10 illegals. On July 9, 2010, at Vienna International Airport, the exchange occurred on the tarmac. A plane carrying the 10 Russian illegals from the United States landed at approximately 2:30 p.m. local time. A plane carrying 4 individuals released from Russian prisons landed minutes later. The prisoners were exchanged in a process that took less than an hour and was reminiscent of Cold War spy exchanges that had occurred at the same location decades earlier. By 4:00 p.m., Vienna time, Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova were on a plane to Moscow. By evening, they had landed at Sheremetyevo International Airport, where they were met by senior officials from the SVR and other Russian intelligence services. By July 10, 2010, they were in Moscow, where Vladimir Putin personally welcomed them at a meeting documented by Russian state media. Timothy and Alexander remained in the United States with uncertain citizenship status and no clear legal path forward. In August 2010, the Canadian government informed Timothy and Alexander that their citizenship was being revoked on grounds that children born to foreign intelligence officers operating under false identities were not entitled to citizenship even if born on Canadian soil. The legal reasoning, outlined in a statement from Citizenship and Immigration Canada, relied on provisions in Canadian law that excluded children of foreign diplomats from birthright citizenship. The government's position was that intelligence officers operating under deep cover were functionally equivalent to diplomatic personnel for purposes of citizenship law. Timothy was 20 years old and had been enrolled at Boston University. Alexander was 16 and had been preparing to enter his junior year of high school. The revocation meant they were no longer Canadian citizens, had never legally been Canadian citizens, and had no claim to Canadian documentation or consular protection. Their American status was equally precarious. They had been living in the United States on the basis of their Canadian citizenship, which no longer existed. According to immigration attorneys consulted by the FBI during this period, the boys had no legal basis to remain in the United States beyond temporary humanitarian provisions. They were not American citizens. They had no valid travel documents. And according to Russian citizenship law, they were Russian citizens by descent, born to Russian parents regardless of where the births had occurred. The Russian government moved quickly to issue them Russian passports, documents that arrived through diplomatic channels in September 2010. According to correspondence between Russian consular officials and the U.S. State Department, Russia was prepared to facilitate the boys' relocation to Moscow and to provide them with housing, financial support, and educational opportunities once they arrived. Timothy and Alexander had minimal Russian language skills. According to their later interviews, they had never studied Russian formally, had heard it only occasionally in movies or from other people, and could barely construct basic sentences. They had never visited Russia. They had no friends there, no family connections beyond parents they now barely recognized, no cultural knowledge beyond what any American high school student might have absorbed from news coverage or popular culture. The decision to relocate was not truly a decision. Without Canadian or American citizenship, without legal status in any country except Russia, they had nowhere else to go. According to legal filings related to their case, they explored possibilities for remaining in the United States through asylum claims or other humanitarian provisions. But immigration attorneys advised that their applications would likely be denied given that they had family in Russia and faced no persecution there. In October 2010, Timothy and Alexander left the United States for Moscow. They flew on Russian passports issued in names they were still learning to think of as their own. Surnames that belonged to parents they were being forced to reconceptualize as foreign intelligence officers rather than the Canadian professionals they had believed them to be. The flight was approximately 10 hours. According to one brother's later account, they spent most of it in silence, looking out the window at an ocean and then a continent moving beneath them, carrying them toward a country that was supposed to be home, but felt entirely foreign. By late 2010, according to Russian immigration records referenced in international media coverage, Timothy and Alexander had relocated to Moscow, a city they had never visited, to live in a country whose language they spoke poorly and whose culture was as unfamiliar to them as any foreign nation would be to someone who had spent their entire lives believing they were Canadian and American. In Russia, Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova were treated not as convicted criminals deported from the United States, but as intelligence officers who had successfully completed a decades-long deep cover mission. Vladimir Putin met with them personally on July 10, 2010, the day after their arrival in Moscow. The meeting was photographed by Russian state media and broadcast on national television. Putin praised their service and dedication, describing them as patriots who had sacrificed personal comfort for the security interests of the Russian Federation. They were awarded state honors. According to Russian government announcements, both received the Medal of Courage for their intelligence work. They appeared on Russian television programs, giving interviews about their experiences living undercover in North America. In these interviews, they described the operational challenges of maintaining false identities for 2 decades, the careful discipline required to never speak Russian at home, and the professional satisfaction of serving their country in circumstances that required extraordinary personal commitment. In 2012, Andrei Bezrukov published a novel about Russian intelligence officers working undercover in the West. The book became a bestseller in Russia. He gave readings at bookstores in Moscow and St. Petersburg, signed copies for fans who treated him as a celebrity, and appeared at literary festivals where he discussed the intersection of espionage and fiction. Elena Vavilova became a commentator on intelligence matters for Russian media outlets, providing analysis of international security issues and occasionally discussing the tradecraft involved in deep cover operations. They were public figures, recognized on the street, invited to speak at universities and professional conferences. According to Russian media coverage, they lived comfortably in Moscow, their service to the state having earned them financial security and social status. According to interviews they gave to Russian media outlets, they expressed pride in their work and gratitude for their reception in Russia. When asked about the personal costs of their mission, they occasionally mentioned the difficulty of living separated from their culture and language for 20 years. They rarely discussed in detail the consequences their work had imposed on their children. What Timothy and Alexander were grappling with in the months and years after their relocation, according to interviews they gave to international media, was not just cultural adjustment, but fundamental identity dissolution. They had spent 20 and 16 years, respectively, believing they were Canadian, attending schools where they pledged allegiance to different flags, speaking a language that was supposed to be their native tongue, living in a culture they understood as their own. And then in the span of 47 minutes on a June morning, all of that had been retroactively invalidated. Learning Russian as adults was, according to Timothy's account in a 2011 interview with The Guardian, disorienting in ways that went beyond the normal challenges of language acquisition. He was learning the language his parents had spoken fluently his entire life, but had chosen never to teach him. Every conjugation, every vocabulary word, every grammatical structure represented something his parents had deliberately withheld. The language felt less like a tool for communication and more like evidence of the magnitude of the deception they had maintained. They enrolled in intensive Russian courses at a language institute in Moscow. According to their later descriptions, they spent months studying grammar and vocabulary like any foreign students would, sitting in classrooms with people who were learning Russian as a second or third language, while technically being Russian citizens by birth. The instructors knew who they were. Their story had been covered extensively in Russian media. And according to Alexander's account, the instructors sometimes didn't know how to categorize them, whether to treat them as native speakers who had somehow never learned their own language, or as foreigners who happened to have Russian parents. The cultural disconnection extended beyond language. They didn't understand references that other Russians their age considered basic cultural knowledge. They hadn't grown up with Russian television shows, Russian music, Russian holidays, or the shared experiences that create social cohesion. According to interviews they gave, making friends was difficult not because Russians were unfriendly, but because every casual conversation revealed gaps in their cultural knowledge that marked them as outsiders despite their citizenship status. Timothy had been studying international relations at Boston University. Those credits did not transfer cleanly to Russian institutions. Alexander had been preparing for his junior year of high school. According to their accounts, navigating the Russian education system required starting over in ways that set them back academically and professionally. They had lost not just their countries, but their educational trajectories, their career plans, and the futures they had been working toward. The psychological impact, described in their interviews, centered on the impossibility of trust. If their parents had maintained a complete fiction for 20 years without ever breaking character, what else in their lives might be false? How could they trust their own memories when those memories were constructed within a framework of systematic deception? According to Timothy's statement in a 2013 interview with the New York Times, the hardest part was not anger at his parents, but the realization that he couldn't be certain which emotions his parents had felt genuinely and which had been performance. They maintained contact with their parents, but the relationship was fundamentally altered. According to their accounts, they saw Andrei and Elena occasionally, had dinners together, attempted to construct something that resembled a family relationship. But the foundation of that relationship, the shared history they had believed in, had been exposed as operational cover. Every childhood memory was now suspect. Every moment of apparent parental affection now carried the question of whether it had been genuine or strategic. In a 2015 interview with CBC News, one of the brothers stated that the most difficult aspect was not the relocation itself, but the realization that his parents had possessed the operational discipline to maintain a complete fiction throughout his entire childhood without a single break in character. That level of sustained deception, he said, made it impossible to know what had been real and what had been part of the mission. The case directly influenced both intelligence policy and popular culture, becoming the primary inspiration for the television series The Americans, which premiered on the FX network in 2013 and ran for 6 seasons. The show's creators, Joe Weisberg and Joel Fields, cited the arrest of the 10 Russian illegals as the catalyst for the series, which depicted Soviet intelligence officers living undercover as an American married couple with children who knew nothing of their parents' real identities. The operational implications were analyzed extensively in counterintelligence circles. According to declassified assessments from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the case demonstrated that Russian intelligence services maintained commitment to deep cover operations even decades after the end of the Cold War. The SVR had invested enormous resources in creating and sustaining false identities for operatives who would spend 20 years building cover before producing significant intelligence returns. That level of patience and operational commitment suggested that similar illegals might still be operating in the United States and other Western countries. The case raised questions about the ethics of using children as components of intelligence operations. According to academic analyses published in intelligence studies journals, Timothy and Alexander had been operational assets without their knowledge or consent. Their existence had enhanced their parents' cover, made the family appear more legitimate, and provided additional reasons for Andrei and Elena to remain embedded in their communities. The children had been tools in an operation they never agreed to participate in, and the consequences of that operation had fundamentally altered the trajectory of their lives. Federal law enforcement agencies modified their screening procedures for certain visa categories and enhanced scrutiny of individuals with limited verifiable history prior to their arrival in the United States. According to FBI counterintelligence training materials developed after 2010, the case became a standard reference point for identifying potential deep cover operatives, with particular attention to individuals whose background documentation, while technically valid, lacked the kind of extensive corroborating details that accumulate naturally over a lifetime. The case remained a subject of study in intelligence training programs at both the CIA and FBI. According to former intelligence officers who have written about the case, it is used to illustrate both the capabilities of Russian intelligence services and the human costs of long-term deep cover operations. The psychological impact on Timothy and Alexander became a case study in understanding the collateral damage that espionage operations can inflict on individuals who were never intended targets. The fundamental questions the case raised about identity, deception, and the relationship between parents and children had no clear policy solutions. How intelligence services should balance operational effectiveness against the welfare of children born into deep cover operations remained an unresolved ethical problem. The story of Andrei Bezrukov, Elena Vavilova, and their sons Timothy and Alexander is not a simple narrative about right and wrong. It is a case study in the calculations people make when national duty and family welfare exist in irreconcilable conflict. From the Russian perspective, Andrei and Elena were exemplary intelligence officers who spent 20 years in deep cover, gathering valuable strategic intelligence while maintaining perfect operational security. They served their country with dedication that required extraordinary personal sacrifice and professional discipline. From their children's perspective, they were parents who had constructed their son's entire reality as an operational tool, who had raised them inside a systematic deception so complete that every childhood memory was now compromised by the knowledge that it had occurred within a fabricated context. Both perspectives are accurate. The question of whether Andrei and Elena's service justified the psychological cost imposed on Timothy and Alexander has no objective answer. The question of whether intelligence services should use children as unknowing components of deep cover operations remains unresolved in policy and ethics discussions. What is documented, according to the court records, the FBI reports, and the interviews Timothy and Alexander gave over the years, is that two young men lost their citizenship, their country, their language, and their ability to trust the fundamental narratives that had structured their understanding of who they were. Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova spent 20 years building identities that were entirely false because their intelligence service required it, and their children spent years afterward dismantling those identities to discover what, if anything, beneath them had been real. Both realities are true, and both are forms of devastation depending on which angle you view them from.